Hi, my name is Rob Bergman and I work at Unicorn Factory as Chief Investment Officer.
Welcome to the African Tech Roundup, Rob.
Thank you so much.
Let's talk about investing in infrastructure on the African continent. What gets someone like you from the Netherlands interested in that as a commercial investment opportunity?
Well, I've moved to South Africa, Johannesburg, 12 years ago. And that was the moment that I realized there was so much to do on the continent. And that doesn't mean so much to do from an NGO charity point of view. There's actually a lot of opportunities that people are currently missing out on because there's not enough capital on the continent to achieve all the ambitions that we have to grow the infrastructure digitally and also physical infrastructure. So from I think a personal point of view, to have a little bit more impact in the world. I'm not doing that from a charity point of view, to actually make a good return out of it. I think when I came to South Africa 12 years ago, I saw that South Africa and the rest of the continent were a beautiful place to put some of the skills that I developed over my life at work. And from an investment point of view is where I come from. That immediately triggered my interest.
What is your background that set you up to be able to spot that as a unique opportunity, but also an addressable one?
So I come out of a stable of mergers and acquisitions, corporate finance as we call it, and that is very much focused on the capital agenda. So anybody that has a business that needs to get funded or people that want to make further investments, that comes with a lot of work and assessment. And that's a particular skill set that a lot of people around the world have, and people specialize in certain niches. But to do that in a more difficult environment as in Africa, I think that also requires a little bit of the aptitude that you need to have to make something work in this continent. So I had an opportunity with my career in the Netherlands to come to South Africa. And I took that opportunity. I wanted to explore the world and see what was going on. And a lot of my colleagues went to London, as one does when they work in Europe and they want to work in investments and corporate finance. But I found emerging markets much more interesting. So I found myself with an opportunity in South Africa, and I used that as a springboard to actually see what was going on the continent.
That's interesting to me. Transitioning from being here on someone else's ticket, advancing someone else's mandate, to developing your own thesis and wanting to back your own sense of what you should be or could be investing in. What was that transition for you? And were there any inciting factors?
I started as an advisor on the continent. And at this moment in time, I'm an advisor and an investor. So I haven't changed that much over the course of my life. And when you see what the skill set is that you need, it is all actually the same skill set of bringing people and opportunities together. So it doesn't necessarily matter where you come from. It matters how you do that and the willingness to actually do that. Because in Europe, and specifically where I came from, deals are actually quite interesting, but easy to implement, and the impact of it is not as deep as you can imagine that you can achieve in Africa. So it comes from a willingness to make that work.
So then digital infrastructure specifically, given all the things you could be focusing on, how does that bubble to the surface as a priority?
So it didn't start with digital infrastructure. I think 12 years ago, digital infrastructure wasn't all the hype that it is today. DFIs, as we call them, the developmental finance institutions, they weren't focused that much yet on the sector. Everything was more around food and agriculture. So that's also where I started myself. From South Africa, I had a chance to work in Dubai for a family office in the meantime too. And we invested quite a large amount of money into Africa, but also focusing again on food and agriculture, logistics. And it was only when I came back to South Africa around 2016 that I really saw the opportunity that digital infrastructure was bringing, because technology was getting cheaper, licensing environments were opening up on the continent, and you saw in South Africa the real boom in internet as we have seen it over the last 2 decades. And that was all brought together by the government seeing what the opportunity was and opening up the licensing environment, but private parties doing that. And also the international community seeing that if you connect people and you give people information, that's empowering, right? So if you can connect the unconnected, that gives them so many more opportunities. One, it creates more disposable income because people actually have to pay less for data, but it also allows them to access information that was previously only accessible to the privileged. People can educate themselves and get a skill set that they can deploy to work in the rest of the world too. So the opportunities for digital infrastructure are amazing. And this happened only, I would say, around 2015, 2016 on a massive scale in Africa. So I picked up on this trend when I came back. And in my advisory days, I started to specialize a bit in the digital infrastructure space. And I was lucky enough to come across the individuals who are also behind Unicorn Factory, where I joined Unicorn Factory about 9 months ago to be more involved in the actual value chain of digital infrastructure rather than just be an outside advisor.
How does someone like you and your team at the Unicorn Factory frame, I suppose, a broader opportunity, but within that opportunity, the verticals within it when it comes to digital infrastructure? Because that's a buzz phrase for many people. And I find it tends to cover everything from fiber to mobile telcos to, I suppose, even big tech, a la cloud. And so how do you frame it within the context of the African opportunity?
Well, for myself and personally, I think it still very much revolves around connecting the unconnected. And when I look at the technologies out there for myself, it becomes an open market when fiber becomes an important means of connecting people. I think the MNOs, the mobile network operators, have done a great job with what they have been doing in the last couple of years. Couple of decades even. But when you really want to, on a affordable basis, connect people in more rural areas and you want to really make internet affordable, I personally believe fiber is the way to do that. And I found partners in Unicorn Factory who actually believed the same thing. And they saw an opportunity of my skill set, what I could bring to the group. Well, they were actually entrepreneurs and having their own businesses. And I actually wanted to move more from just an advisory side to also be part of businesses and grow these intrinsically. So my ambitions and their ambitions actually were quite the same, coming from different angles. And we found each other by mere chance, I guess. But we kept in contact and we started discussions. And only 9 months ago, I've joined this group by now, and I can see what we've already achieved. It's been quite remarkable. But I think about a year and a half ago, we saw this opportunity coming and we set ourselves up quite nicely to put this group together as it is right now.
Digital infrastructure that doesn't account for real world hardware assets, work that might get dirt under your fingernails, as it were. In your world, it sounds like that would be a misnomer. There's often talk of the likes of Google, for example, as a major infrastructure player and thinking of infrastructure as a construct working on top of, say, a functional internet or assuming access or connectivity of some kind. In your world, is that a misnomer as an investor?
No, it actually comes from both worlds. So we like to be part of every level of the value chain that makes up internet. So when I look at our group comes out of a company called WorkOnline. And one of the founders of WorkOnline had a great idea behind Unicorn Factory. And WorkOnline is one of Africa's largest IP transit providers. So when you're an IP transit provider, you're quite in the nucleus of what's going on in internet in Africa. You speak a lot with the ISPs, you speak a lot with the data centers, you speak a lot with the OTTs and the big American companies that you just referred to yourself. So you're quite well aware of what needs to happen to make internet grow.
What makes WorkOnline as a model? It sounds like almost an ecosystem API within digital transformation as an instigating stakeholder to the kind of investment you now do. What business are they in?
When I'm a layman coming into it, so maybe when my team listens to me, maybe they disagree. But I think I always convince people a little bit when I compare to the Google Maps of internet. So you can have a normal street and that's a normal infrastructure. And we also build that. That's dark fiber. You can have switches, which are crossroads, and you can go left, you can go right, you can go straight, but it allows you to go left or right or straight, but you don't know if you should go left or right or straight. And then you have IP transit, which is actually the Google Maps of the internet, which allows that infrastructure that you've just put in place to actually be used as something that is actually very valuable in your life because you now know where you need to go. Because you in South Africa or anywhere else in the world want to speak to somebody else across the world and you need to know how to get there. So the infrastructure needs to be in place, but it needs to be rooted. So IP transit providers do that for us. And with that, you're actually using the infrastructure, you're interconnecting with people and communities and networks. And that makes you a very important part of that value chain and gives you very good insight in what's happening in that value chain.
And so where do the more highly branded players in your industry fit in that picture? So the mobile telcos, the fiber to the home providers, or even the wholesalers, then the providers to consumers, where do they fit in that world?
We decided to be carrier neutral. So it's quite an interesting different play that we don't have a mobile network operator in our group. And when you look at who's actually providing this kind of infrastructure on the continent, it actually usually comes out of what we call carriers. So that's why the carrier neutral term refers to a group that doesn't have an MNO in its group. And in Africa, we all know Vodacom, we know MTN, we know Safaricom. Those are the groups that are usually in charge of the first rollout of these kind of assets. So legacy-wise, you will feel a lot of the data centers and a lot of the fiber infrastructure was rolled out by these particular parties. But these parties also have reasonably monopolistic position in the market. So when you want to open up this market to other parties, the licensing environment needs to open up, like we've done in South Africa and like what's happening in Kenya, which allows for every part of that value chain to be serviced by other people. So we've decided in our group that if we are part of this value chain, we understand it quite nicely. There's a role for us to play as a carrier neutral group to do this with separate companies that service each part of this value chain rather than one big operating company that, yes, they do it, but it's all one company and it's part of a carrier. So it has another objective to fulfill rather than servicing you as a customer that just wants to use its data center, which might be an afterthought to them because it's their data center that they use for their own operations. So we've made our own investments in dark fiber. And dark fiber means you actually roll out the cable that facilitates internet. We set up our own company that does transmission services. So we create capacity and we light the fiber.
So is that the sort of work Liquid, for example, in Liquid Technologies might be that sort of business?
Yeah. So when you compare who's doing this out there in Africa, I think Wayok, Liquid are the very good examples that everybody will know. But it also comes from a carrier group that is owned by telecommunications companies that does it as one company, and it does it with also probably ulterior angles, because even a Liquid has separated their Africa data center group to make it look carrier neutral. But at the end, Liquid is still a shareholder.
And someone else might think twice before sort of relying on their backbone to build out their business, especially if they're already competing for the same customer.
Exactly. So we ourselves are backing a particular group of people that's called Pan-African Internet Exchange. PAX is a data center operator coming out of the Netherlands. They're active in this moment Kenya, Ghana, rolling out in other African countries by their Series B capital raise that they've recently completed. And when you look at that, that's a completely neutrally owned infrastructure provider, a data center operator. And that is the preference also for our group. For example, when WorkOnline puts their points of presence in certain data centers, we prefer that is also a carrier neutral data center. That doesn't mean it necessarily has to. And in certain countries and in certain markets, you don't even have the opportunity yet because those carrier neutral data centers aren't there yet. But it doesn't mean that we want to push carrier neutrality a lot. And therefore we sponsor within our group the carrier neutral agenda very much. So our dark fiber, transmission, IP transit, and our investment in PAX. So as a carrier neutral data center is all from a carrier neutral point of view. And you can call us. We can give you either dark fiber, or we can give you transmission, or we can give you data center capacity or IP transit. And there's no carrier involved there. And when you look on the continent, there's not a lot of groups out there that actually are able to provide that on a pan-African basis. Per country, you have certain offerings, but for all the layers of value in that value chain, on a pan-African basis, there's not a lot of parties out there. We saw the opportunity there to make a difference.
I'm just wondering what's behind this. Is this, and maybe I'm also thinking for a policymaker listening to us, right? Who's quite familiar with all the brand names in the space, but maybe starting to lean in on it might be better for the policy roadmap they're working on to think about a more agnostic system that ensures that maybe monopolies don't form as readily as maybe in the past. What are some of the bigger themes that are a backdrop to a strategy like yours?
Well, I guess there's two drivers here, and one is external and one is for us internal. The external one is probably the easiest to describe, and that is actually the policy. Because if there's not an open licensing requirement, a licensing environment, then you cannot build as a third party, as an unlicensed entity, you cannot build internet infrastructure. And that's as simple as it is. So some of the countries in Africa still have a very closed environment with regard to their regulations. And the blueprint is there. You've seen it in other parts of the world. And I think in Africa, South Africa is the most beautiful example. What happens when a regulator opens up the market that is till that time basically dominated by a party like Telkom? And I've been in South Africa long enough to have experienced Telkom a little bit myself and all the good people of Telkom. But I mean, it wasn't the nicest experience as an end user to have to be dependent on this one party that wasn't always delivering on what they said they would be delivering. I now live in South Africa in an environment where I can call anybody for my internet and it's done in a day, and the user experience is incredibly good. And when there's a complaint, it gets solved on the same day too, which is something that you would wish for the whole continent to happen. And it has to come from a regulator that starts with opening up that environment to allow private parties to come to the party. So how has that happened, for example, also in South Africa? When the licensing environment was opening up, you can see parties like Seacom with a private carrier-neutral subsea cable coming online, with a Terraco having a carrier-neutral data center, a party like a Vumatel rolling out carrier-neutral as a carrier-neutral party, fiber infrastructure to the homes, and a party like WorkOnline providing carrier-neutral IP transit. And now you have an ecosystem of people who, from a carrier neutrality point of view and from a private party point of view, have achieved in South Africa what we have seen over the last decade or two, which is an amazing story, but it's also not that difficult to achieve as a market when it starts with a regulator opening up the environment.
Playing devil's advocate there, I mean, you've described a lot of special interests, a lot of commercial players who all are not getting out of bed for their health. They really, this has to be worth their while. They've got shareholders to please, hard-nosed capitalist intent, and not to demonize that at all. But I empathize with certain policymakers who might see that as not necessarily without sort of policing immediately in the best interests of their citizens. How would you convince a policymaker who sees the benefit pragmatically of delivering with that level of efficiency, but then questions whether or not we should just be protectionist about the space because it's a hugely important area to have control and ensure the best for our citizens?
Well, I'm a liberal at heart, and I believe in freedom for people to want to express themselves and want to do for what is best for them. And with that comes a belief that free markets are the best way to achieve things. And I think when we look over the 20th century and what has happened in this century, I don't think there's a lot of examples of where a restrictive environment has been good for people, where governments controlling people's thoughts by the sake of controlling information and controlling assets has led to a better outcome for those people than where free markets were allowed to deploy and go as they could. Capitalism comes with its abundances, right? So you have to control it at some moment in time, but to restrict the market from the start because you're afraid that it's going to open up, I personally believe that there's no evidence around the world that is best for its citizens. So my strong belief is open up the environment and the market will do its thing. People and capital will find its way to where it is best allocated, where people have needs get solved. It's better to solve a need than to bring something to the market that people don't need, which often happens in regulated environments. And the market will do itself. And then we can see where excesses occur, and then we can rein in the excesses.
How do you explain what you do now to the world you left behind in investments? Do they see it as PE? Do they see it as VC? Is there a bucket for it? And maybe use that as a springboard for giving us a sense of what sort of ticket size investments you play in and who your peer group in that space is.
So it's a nice bridge to the second pillar that we didn't touch on just now. We as a group have decided to work within two pillars, and one we call our holdings, which are the assets we just spoke about. And we, together with partners, have founded these assets. We control these assets. We're invested in these assets, and we're trying to grow them organically and putting our own capital behind that. And we saw a big need on the continent to actually also make sure that people get funding, because I think everybody would agree when they look around the continent is that the capital markets are shallow. African capital itself is not enough to make all these investments. So we need outside investments, and it's very difficult to attract these outside investments to Africa too. So when you have a group of people that I fortunately have in my team, on my pillar one, in my holdings, they're the best in their game. They understand internet and building infrastructure in Africa very well. And with my skill set and the team that I've built around our advisory part, our pillar two, we've actually built a very good skill set around capital raises. So we can bring those two skill sets together. And this brings, I think, the niche offering that we as Unicorn Factory are positioning in the market as a group of very specialized entrepreneur operators that understand exactly how internet works, who is in contact with all the vendors that are needed for it, are in contact with all the clients and the big American companies in this particular case, the MNOs on the continent, to make internet work, together with a capital raising skill set where we know where to tap into the international capital markets to get that capital to Africa for these projects. So our second pillar is called Unicorn Factory Advisory Services, where we really service external clients as an advisor, where they can mandate us to raise capital for mainly their digital infrastructure projects in Africa, where we will go out for them into the international markets. And we don't invest in that ourselves because we usually pick the projects that don't really fit in our holdings pillar, but still are very worthwhile getting funded. And therefore,
so why wouldn't they fit? Is it because of the size, or just is it staying true to your thesis?
Exactly. So I can imagine, and I don't have a client like that, but other data centers, we backed the PEX data center group. So if I raise capital for another data center, there's nothing wrong with that other data center, but I can't fund another data center that doesn't fit within my strategy. Another good example are the internet service providers on the continent. So with WorkOnline, with our internet, we service a lot of the ISPs on the continent. So it would be very weird for me to fund one or two ISPs and basically neglect all the other ISPs that also need funding and make a selection within that while I service all of them as a client, because I already know what kind of phone calls I'm going to get from all these ISPs that didn't get my funding. So as a strategy, it's much better for me to go out into the market and find other parties on a case-by-case basis, and they can make their own determination if this is a worthwhile investment to get all these ISPs funded with external funding. Because what now happens when they receive this funding, they can roll out. This ecosystem grows. This particular party grows, and I win still because I get a little bit of fees. Of course, I'm also not a charity. You asked it before, but we're also doing this for a little bit of profit because the economics work in such a way that it is a profitable venture. You just need to convince the international capital markets that the opportunities are here. We are very skilled at that, so we managed to do that. So I get fees out of my transactions that I can deploy in my own assets again. But also when the ISPs win, the consumers win, and internet wins. So what happens when internet wins? We get the South African situation again, which also allows all my other assets to grow very organically because now there's more internet traffic, there's more need for dark fiber routes, there's more need for transmission, etc., etc. So with our combined strategy by raising capital for other parties, it actually flows back immediately into everything else that we own and everything else that we do because the whole ecosystem wins.
Pretty much a brilliant network and community strategy, right? Because we were talking offline and I said to you, I think what stood out to me when we first started chatting, we met the other day, was there's an intuitive grasp of, but also a very strategic weaving of engineered mutual beneficiation and what I call community and network practice that's actually built into your business model in a way that I hadn't quite heard about before, which is fascinating. But also, I was trying to force with my initial question about how you explain yourself to your investment colleagues from yesteryear. I just wonder how you explain what you just said to them and what sort of buckets the work you do currently fits in that world.
It touches on a couple of your earlier questions, actually. So yes, it is very unique in Africa. There's not a lot of groups like us that do what we do. You will find some of the investors themselves, they also have a bit of an advisory angle to it, but those are usually the private equity venture capital like investors. There's not a lot of groups of actual operators and entrepreneurs and who have gone through the grind themselves as part of a group of advisors who are really out there to make the ecosystem win. So as a mission, I think it's a great mission that we have established, but it's not a mission that we said, well, let's do good for the continent and do it for free. It's actually showing that you can do this on a profitable basis because the economic opportunities are there. Somebody just needs to grab the opportunities and put some weight behind it, bring the right people with the right skill sets and bring the international community here to Africa to unlock those opportunities. Yeah, so that's also how I can explain the journey that we started with, right? And if you see the opportunities that are here, it doesn't have to be charity. It has to be impact. And you can make a difference in your life by getting digital infrastructure into the continent. And everybody actually makes a profit out of it. And my liberal nature is I don't believe in charity because it's not sustainable. When do you have a sustainable investment is when actually there's positive cash flow, keeping that business alive. Otherwise, the business will disappear by itself anyway. So how do we make structural changes on the continent and to people's lives? Is to have profitable businesses that are well funded with a good cost of capital, that we get the whole world together to actually achieve this. And everybody wins. And I saw this when I was in South Africa. And you asked me before, like, what really triggered that? I think what was missing is that people were not looking at this as a profitable venture. I think people were still looking at it as a charitable venture. And when you look at things as charity, it's a once-off. So once you get the structure right, that people in every part of the value chain can make a return on their capital. Investors can make a return on their capital. But in the same time, you unlock opportunities for people and people get to spend more and economies actually start to thrive. Now you have a system that actually works for everybody in this value chain. And that was something that I saw was missing on the continent and I wanted to contribute. And I thought digital infrastructure was actually the best sector to achieve that, because when you look at other sectors, it is actually more tough. For example, just agriculture. It is such a different profile. You're so dependent on the weather that you can have the same kind of mindset, but to make that change, it's very hard. But digital infrastructure, by the nature of its infrastructure and what it actually also does to the disposable income of people on the ground, you can immediately measure that result. It's a very investable asset. So let's start with the easy one to make people's lives better and then work towards the more difficult ones.
So I'm just thinking in terms of the things you would invest in and, you know, what your ticket sizes for that are, and then the funds you are helping raise and how big those efforts are. Yeah, just in terms of just sizing the effort you're putting into all of this.
On our holdings, the first pillar, the biggest asset by far is WorkOnline, and that's owned by partners that have founded. One of the partners has founded Unicorn Factory. All the other investments we started in the recent months even, or in the last 24 months. So they're quite young companies and they're now working very hard to grow, hopefully into unicorns in the next coming years. PAX is a bit of a bigger business. We have a small investment in that, but we're helping them, for example, with their Series B capital raise. On the advisory side, we started 9 months ago. And by now we have mandated or are about to mandate around $900 million for the African continent. And that's actually quite a big chunk of capital to place in the international markets. So we're very excited that people are trusting us. But I think it comes from the offering that we have that is quite unique in the market. And people also seeing that we're not here for a quick buck. We're actually here to make everybody's lives better. So a lot of people have trusted us with their mandates, or are about to trust us with their capital raising mandates. And hopefully when we speak again in the next 2 years, I will have achieved $900 million of investments in Africa for my clients in Pillar 2 as the Unicorn Factory Advisory Services.
Well, no pressure.
I need the international community to step up with that, right? And you asked, like, what tickets do you write? Like, I don't write these tickets, right? My shareholders don't write these tickets. Money that we have, money that we make, we mainly invest in those assets I mentioned in Pillar 1. We need to grow our dark fiber. We need to grow transmission.
Yeah, but what size is it? Now, are we talking tens of millions? Are we talking hundreds of millions? Are they larger?
So interestingly enough, when you start these businesses, people think about those kind of numbers. You really don't need that kind of money to start these businesses. Also, again, we're talking about digital infrastructure. So once you deliver projects, there's a lot of cash that actually flows back to you because of the nature of how these projects are priced. So working capital is the main thing that you need to get funded. And then we're talking about far smaller numbers than that. Without mentioning the numbers you just mentioned, that's actually not what you need to build this infrastructure. When you talk about data centers, okay, we start to talk about more proper numbers because now you're talking about real property that you need to put in place. But no, we're not talking about those numbers. The numbers are small that you need to really make an impact in Africa. But when we speak about actually rolling out fiber infrastructure and when we're talking about putting in data centers, which is more on my advisory side, then we're starting to talk about the real numbers, $900 million that you really need from international partners because that kind of capital just isn't available in Africa, as we know. So this is why I need the Americans and I need Europeans, the people in the Middle East and the people in Asia to come to the party and fund these projects with me.
Well, that's as good a place as any to put it down. Rob Bergman of Unicorn Factory, thanks for being on the African Tech Roundup.
Thank you very much.